Well, it's my great pleasure to be able to make this presentation to the ARES meetings. I've very much enjoyed attending your meetings in person over the last couple of decades. Excellent experiences for me, both in New Zealand and Australia. Unfortunately, I couldn't be here uh, there in person today, but I do want to share this talk with you. The title of the talk is Global to Local to Global Analysis of Land and Water Sustainability. It sounds like a mouthful, but I hope to show you why I think this is particularly important um, and a novel approach to some of these sustainability issues through a series of examples. We begin by our motivation for GLASSNET is the Global Sustainable Development Goals from the United Nations. There are 17 of these, and if you look at them more closely, you'll see that half of them really depend critically on land and water resources, and those land and water resources are increasingly stressed. As we looked at research around the Sustainable Development Goals, land and water, um, we found that much of the research fell into one of three different traps. It was either disciplinary, largely speaking, so economic, hydrologic, ecologic, and that, of course, in the present day limits the validity of findings. Perhaps more salient is the critique that most of this is local in nature. Now, of course, all sustainability questions are local. They depend on the local governance, the local climate, soils, water, and so on. So clearly you need the local dimension, but without the global context and feedbacks, um, one risks um, really missing the boat, and I want to illustrate that in my talk. And finally, of course, there's this problem that a lot of these approaches are very complex and hard to replicate, hard for others to pick up and utilize, and therefore not very transparent. So the theme behind our work, as you could see from the title, is global to local to global analysis. And so this recognizes first and foremost that global forces are driving local sustainability stresses, whether it's climate, population, income growth, trade policies. These are things happening at the global scale, but with very significant local consequences. So these give rise to local stresses. We'll be talking about groundwater, water quality in particular in this talk. Um, the solutions obviously vary by locality. The governance, the local conditions are very important. You can't think about general solutions to water scarcity, for example. So the solutions are going to be local. However, these local responses, when aggregated up, can have global consequences. So global, local, global. And of course, the transdisciplinary theme is going to be featured throughout this talk. You'll see that in the form of photos of collaborators from many different disciplines. So I'm going to talk first about groundwater sustainability in irrigated agriculture and to really highlight the global, local, global theme. We're going to look at this both in the context of the US and at global scale. And then we'll turn to water quality challenges. I want to highlight some very recent work we've been doing across a variety of disciplines. So starting with groundwater sustainability, here's a visualization of the share of unsustainable groundwater and groundwater use. This was produced using the WBM model and database. Danielle Grogan there and Iman Hagigi, but it's been this point has been made very forcefully by WADA et al., for example, 2014, where they estimated a tripling of unsustainable groundwater abstraction globally over a 50-year period and projecting significant growth in the coming decades. So this is clearly a problem across the world. What are the implications? Well, the hydrologists have been out front on this issue, and here are some examples of what they consider the potential implications: compromising future livelihoods of millions of people and living standards from Gletti, highlighting that the potential for skyrocketing food prices and profound economic and political ramifications. So these are important things, economic considerations that need to be addressed as well by economists. So we'll be looking at this question about the consequences of reducing groundwater abstraction to more sustainable levels. Going to start out illustrating global drivers of local groundwater sustainability stresses. So we're going to focus on the Western US in this case, and then we'll back out and look at the whole globe. So if we look at the Western US, groundwater withdrawal to recharge ratios are quite dramatic in parts of the West. In the California Central Valley, there are places where withdrawals exceed recharge by 10 times. So you can literally track the declining, ground level with this declining aquifer is very dramatic. So irrigated agriculture is clearly a key driver. It also accounts for groundwater component of that accounts for more than 40% of irrigation withdrawals in the US, and that's been growing rapidly. That share's doubled since 1950. It is the go-to option for many farmers now. Add to this dramatic distortion in water markets, in quotes, water prices, again in quotes, for agriculture are a fraction of those in other sectors. I mean, tell me one other factor or commodity where you have this kind of a dramatic difference from $27 to $3,200. Not exactly the same commodity, but very close. And it's just the distortions are dramatic, and demands for water are growing rapidly outside of agriculture. So it's clear that agriculture is going to have to be accommodating this adjustment, and we want to look at the implications of that. We're going to use the Simple G modeling framework. It's based on the simple model, which was developed actually initially for classroom teaching. That's why it's simple. It's partial equilibrium. It focuses on crops, income, population, biofuels. These are the key drivers. They're exogenous, and we look at endogenous adjustments within the sector. And the beauty of this simple framework is we've been able to put it on a grid cell. So you'll see there are 75,000 grid cells in the US, each of those with their own technology and local characteristics. If you think about how this is constructed, it's a useful lens into the Simple G framework. We start with these 17 simple model regions and then break out one particular region. In this case, the US. There's also Simple G models for China, Brazil, and there are global Simple G models. When it's broken out then by grid cell, it's then disaggregated into irrigated and rain-fed land. So those are the key distinctions. And at each grid cell, these are the activities and how they're modeled. There's irrigated crops and rain-fed crops. And these have different production functions, different parameters, so different substitutional elasticities, and of course, different resources, in this case, irrigation drawing on surface and groundwater, importantly. Each of those factors have their own factor supply schedule, and we also, as will be important later on, track leaching, which is those functions specific to grid cell and activity. So 5 arc minutes is quite resolved for this kind of modeling, particularly at global scale. So the global drivers that we're interested in here, population, income, productivity, are shown. These are projections from 2010 to 2050, and you can see very greatly across regions. And when we run the model out to the future and decompose the drivers of groundwater withdrawals by region, you can see they vary quite a bit. Why? Because markets aren't perfectly integrated. They're segmented. Rapid population growth in sub-Saharan Africa means that's a more important driver in that region. We can zoom in on the US, and this nice pinwheel shows you that in the US, the dominant drivers of groundwater withdrawals are not in the US. They're coming from other regions, from sub-Saharan Africa in the case of population, from Asia in the case of income growth. So just illustrates that it's not sufficient to just look at the US alone when you're thinking of groundwater withdrawals. So let's look at local responses to these stresses. And So this is the groundwater sustainability scenario we look at in the case of the Western U.S. You can see very significant reductions up to 95% in parts of the Central Valley. So you're essentially going to be fallowing significant amounts of land if it can't revert to rain-fed agriculture. I want to highlight how labor market functioning interacts with these kinds of conservation policies. This is an important project we're just getting going with USDA funding, with the labor forces obviously very differentiated, different types of labor. Many policies in the US have been built on the assumptions that if you were to fallow this land, people would simply move elsewhere. But experience over the last couple of decades suggests that limited labor mobility means people often stay even when factories close down. That's the impact, the consequence of the China shock in trade and manufacturers, and we're concerned something similar might happen in agriculture. Because agricultural labor mobility is decreasing, what are the implications for workers and what are the implications of that lack of mobility for conservation? So here we highlight in a paper that's just come out in Environmental Research Letters, conventional integrated assessment framework, looking at this kind of conservation question for land and water, assumes implicitly a perfectly mobile labor force. So there's quite a bit of adjustment, not only in employment, but also in production, and no change in wages. But when we factor in explicitly labor markets, um, then in this case, there's much less adjustment in production, less effective conservation policy, and big impacts on workers through their wages. So very significant distributional implications. We need to think more about those, and that's the essence of that project. I want to also talk about local to global feedback. And so we've talked about global to local responses. What's the feedback from local to global? And here, Iman Hakiki, as you can see, his photo in the lower right-hand corner, has written a paper. It's under revise and resubmit with ERL, and it focuses on how, not only how this scenario affects the production in a given location, but how that relocates. And this shows relocation of that production within the US, but also overseas. And in the end, the upshot of this is actually more cropland use, both in the US and overseas. Why? Because that land set aside is so very productive. What about global scale groundwater sustainability policies? So we've focused on the US and we looked at what happens if only the US does this, but of course, this is a stress worldwide, as you saw. What happens if there's a broader based policy across the world? And that's what we want to explore next. This is joint work led by Iman Hakiki, but also with Chris Perry, a fellow with a very illustrious career in water economics. And here we're focused on, initially you're seeing a map of irrigation using surface water and groundwater, okay? Very extensive at the top, a share of blue water in totally irrigated crop water use. And at the bottom, you see the share of unsustainable groundwater in groundwater use. So groundwater, as we highlighted earlier, is being used in an unsustainable fashion around the world. And there's certainly hotspots, and those are expected to light up when we implement such a policy. So we're particularly interested in adaptation to this. So this first orange bar here just shows you what happens to global crop production if you enforce this groundwater sustainability policy globally and you don't allow any adjustment. So this is, this is the Wada et al. Famlighetti scenario where they were talking about dramatic impacts. If you reduce global crop availability by this amount, you'd see prices go through the roof because it would be a global phenomenon. Okay, so what kinds of adjustments might occur? We've been able to use the Simple G global model to explore these adjustments and see how they might mitigate these effects. So the first adjustment is substitution. So first of all, of course, if you restrict groundwater, there may be potential for turning to surface water. There may be potential for increasing irrigation efficiency. Of course, that has knock-on implications that one needs to consider, but these are possibilities, improvement to improve the use of, to get more out of less groundwater, or get at least mitigate the impacts of that. The next possibility is to simply revert to rain-fed agriculture. And of course, we've taken into account the fact that the rain-fed yields are lower, that in some cases it's not possible to grow rain-fed crops there. The land will simply be fallowed. However, where it is possible, that has some mitigation possibilities, and we see that here. So that's further mitigation of this reduction in output. So we've cut this reduction in global crop production roughly in half. What else can happen? Well, you can shift production around, and this just shows you the change in irrigated crop production and the change in rain-fed production. So emphasizing that prior point that rain-fed does increase in some places and somewhat around the world. The next type of adjustment is relocation of production. This is what I was saying. You can shift production around. You can relocate that. For example, within the US, production can shift elsewhere. Within Australia, production could shift elsewhere, and that contributes a bit more to this mitigation. So prices go up. There's an incentive to produce where perhaps in an area where you hadn't produced before. And the final aspect is global trade, so that a country can import more from other regions or export less. We saw that in the case of the US groundwater sustainability policy, exports declining, production shifting elsewhere, and not only within the US, the relocation, but elsewhere overseas. So obviously that is constrained by the fact that we're implementing this groundwater sustainability policy globally. So finally, the reduction in global production is very small. And this was a tremendous shock to Chris Perry, our collaborator, and we went back and forth quite a bit. And of course, the first thing was to develop this kind of figure, this kind of decomposition to explain it. Chris in particular thought that we were too optimistic about the substitution term here, B. So Iman reduced that term, the possibility for substitution, in fact, eliminated that. You can't use more surface water, for example. And what happened? The others expanded. So that minus 0.2 doesn't increase that much, maybe by minus 1% or less. So these adjust and they are mutually interacting. And in the end, these we find that this conclusion is rather robust, that the global production and price impacts of such a sustainability policy at global scale are much less than might have been were predicted in the past. Now, this doesn't mean that it isn't a dramatic policy. The local impacts on production, employment, and if you explored labor markets, the wages might be quite significant. And we're seeing that here in this figure. In many cases, dramatic reduction in irrigated crop production in locations, and that could have significant impacts for farmers, workers in those regions. So just to summarize the groundwater sustainability dimension here, that it's a serious challenge across the world, largely driven by agricultural irrigation. Many countries are simply exporting their environment free of charge through the virtual water trade. It's going to limit their capacity to deal with droughts in the future. Absent changes in governance, this is going to be exacerbated by this, as we see, these global drivers. Eliminating these withdrawals can have dramatic impacts locally, but they'll be mitigated globally by these mechanisms that we've outlined. Let me turn in conclusion to the water quality challenges and highlight a project we're currently undertaking. This is focused on water quality, in particular nitrogen. As you see from this figure from Paper in Science by Stefan et al., really nitrogen and phosphorus, we've blown way past the planetary boundaries there, much further than climate. We worry about climate change, but there we're still in a zone of uncertainty, according to Stefan et al. They might change that if they wrote that today, but nonetheless, just highlights how serious these problems are. Biogeochemical flows. And it tends to be more concentrated, obviously local. This isn't a well-mixed pollutant globally. It's a local phenomenon with resulting in eutrophication around the world because of excess nitrogen and fertilizer and phosphorus use in um, agriculture. So we focus in on the Mississippi Basin here, and you can see from these figures that nitrogen is a big part of the problem, and a big part of that's coming from corn and soy production within the Mississippi Basin. So that's our jumping off point. If you look at success over in achieving the EPA's reduction goal of reducing the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, we just haven't made much progress over the last couple of decades. It's still, it varies a great deal from year to year, but you can see 2019, it spiked again. We're just a long way from achieving that, the 45% reduction target that was announced a decade ago. So to look at this question, we've got together a team supported by the NSF Infuse program of modelers and scientists from across many disciplines, and I want to highlight that. We start with the economists, and here we've paired the global general equilibrium model, Envisage, built on the GTAP database, that has been paired with the simple G model of the US, which you've seen a moment ago. Okay, this is a corn soy version of that, really focusing on this part of the country. So within Envisage, we run carbon pricing scenarios, first implementing for the EU policies, but then turning to the US. These are the implications of the US carbon pricing. The carbon pricing is based on the government announced social cost of carbon. So we look at, depending on assumptions, 47, 70, and $139 per ton CO2e. And here you can see the impacts across the economy, but particularly dramatic. The impacts are particularly dramatic for ammonia production and hence the prices of nitrogen fertilizer. You see almost a doubling of nitrogen fertilizer prices. Okay, here we see the consequences, the cascading impacts. So now we use the economists from the simple G framework. These results are passed from Envisage to simple G, and there we can interact closely with the agroecologists, the agro-IBIS model, as well as the hydrologists and aquatic ecologists with the WBM model. So we track these changes for different carbon prices, the changes in crop output, and then the changes in yield and nitrate leaching, having embedded information from the agroecological model within simple G. We can see, for example, at $152 CO2e, we get about almost a 15% reduction in fertilizer use. And the transport to the Gulf is quite a complicated process, and the end reduction in exports is more modest, but still quite significant. So this is an example of how these different modeling frameworks can be brought together to address this challenge. Here we compare the carbon pricing scenario to a wetland scenario. So wetlands are really kind of the preferred option right now for dealing with this problem. They obviously have other benefits as well. And so we've modeled the wetland restoration scenario and contrasted that with a carbon price scenario. And you can see that if you go all the way over to nitrate, leachate, the recharge, which is that nitrates going to the groundwater, and nitrate export, in all cases, the wetlands are dominated by the carbon pricing scenario. So climate policy seems to be succeeding in an area where other approaches, more direct approaches, perhaps have not. And this shows you one other interesting aspect. On the left-hand side, you see the consequences if you just restore wetlands, which is mainly in the heart of the Corn Belt where that occurs, you get spillover effects because less production in the heart of the Corn Belt means higher prices. Areas where the wetlands aren't implemented expand production, potentially expand fertilizer use, and creates adverse spillovers. However, the carbon price policy is more uniform, more extended. It mitigates those spillovers. So it's another benefit, another co-benefit of climate policy. Not only does it improve water quality, but it does it in a more broad-based way. So just to summarize the water quality story, curbing non-point pollution from agriculture is very challenging. 2 decades of effort in the Mississippi Basin, limited success. Um, in addition, more and more concerns about nitrate leaching into rural wells. So pricing carbon as part of a national policy could have important benefits in this area, and we even show that it dominates a wetland scenario. So to wrap up this talk, I'd like to just highlight the importance of high spatial resolution um, if economists want to really engage in the debate around land and water sustainability challenges. We have to meet the scientists at the grid cell level, and that's a challenge. The simple approach has allowed us to do that because we've simplified the economic model to the maximum extent possible. Um, but we found that the global context is also critical. So you need to be matching up at the grid cell level, but you need the global context, hence the global local aspect. So this can offer new insights, this approach. It also offers new collaboration possibilities. I've only touched on a few of them, but biodiversity is another area where there's great scope for contributions here. Indeed, we're in the process of publishing a special issue of Environmental Research Letters. It's forthcoming in 2023. A few papers are already out there. It's based on an April 2022 GLASSNET conference. And these papers are led by early career researchers in the GLASSNET network. There are 6 integrative papers, 6 applications papers, and a synthesis that we're writing as guest editors. So I'd like to invite you to join GLASSNET. It's a long-term NSF-funded network of networks projects, and here's some information on that. So there's a website, and it's actually more than a website. There are models you can run there, data you can upload and share. So if you Google My GeoHub GlassNet, it should get you there. And we're happy to add you to our mailing list. You can see the networks involved in this network of networks. There's GTAP, of course, near and dear to my heart, but the Natural Capital Project, ecologists, Kawasi is hydrologists, and of course, many networks overseas and around the world joining in on this. So I invite you to join us with GlassNet and follow what we're doing, participate. If you're interested, there are opportunities for early career scholars to engage in research exchanges with these different networks as well. So check it out. Thank you very much.